religion is best girl.
Religion is best girl.
It is wife.
Welcome to another episode of Debatable with your hosts, Nina and Kyle. I'm Nina. I studied in St. Scholastica's College, Manila in high school, which makes me a Benedictine.
I'm Kyle. I graduated from San Beda College, Alabang. I'm also Benedictine. Therefore, we know all about that ora et labora, prayer and work.
For this episode, we're gonna talk about religion.
Which is, by the way, one of my favorite topics. I think it might even be the favorite topic for Kyle Atega because I just think it's very underappreciated. Actually, in fact, I think it might be unappreciated by many debaters.
Yeah, I think there hasn't been a lot of religion debates in the previous tournaments I've been to. If anything, they just slightly touch on it, but I haven't seen a tournament that has religion as an explicit theme. It's been kind of a long time.
Well, one of the reasons why I think it's very underappreciated is because people tend to forget how pervasive religious analysis can be for different debates. So, you have a lot of IR debates, you have a lot of politics debates that can be informed by some religious contexts. So, you have the conflict in Israel and Palestine, you have conflicts in India and South Asia when it comes to Hindu nationalism. Yeah, these types of things. People tend to forget that a lot of the time, the debates that we already have lots of religious undertones. But more than that, I just personally really like it because of how important it is to the lives and identities of individuals on the ground. We talk about how it creates communities that are based on a religion. You talk about secular communities, even though they are secular and they don't have any formal, state-sanctioned religion, they're still super affected by religious events. For example, the Philippines, it's technically secular in the Constitution, but we're celebrating Holy Week right now.
Yeah.
We're going to release this on Good Friday, which means that Jesus just died. Apparently, isn't that what it means?
Yes.
Yeah. And it's also the reason why lots of people, even if they do not particularly ascribe to any religion, they also felt the heartbreak that came with witnessing the burning of Notre Dame. It's not because of Notre Dame as a religious symbol, but it's because we know that it is a church that is tightly linked to a culture that has been existing for hundreds and hundreds of years. So it is much more than just the beliefs that people have. It is how those beliefs inform interpersonal relationships and relationships between institutions and other institutions.
So, more specifically to debate then, it's a great way of analyzing relationships. It's a great way, as you mentioned, to understand why politics is the way it is, how international relations is the way it is. I personally believe that it's just a nice frame that people often forget to talk about. Religion is just as important as politics, especially in terms of how people end up behaving and how people end up interacting with each other. And if you're able to better understand that and better utilize that, then you're more likely to have a better and holistic picture of what you want the debate to be.
Yeah, so just a few disclaimers for this episode. The first one is, this is not going to be an episode about the truth value or the correctness or the accuracy of any particular religious belief. This episode will focus on some ways to understand religion as a phenomenon and also how you might be able to apply them in debates.
So another disclaimer is that we're not the main authority when discussing religious matters, so obviously these are just things that we've come across, things we've learned through the years. I'm pretty sure we won't give a complete picture of what religion is and what it encompasses. So, at the end of this, if you think there were certain things we are not able to cover, feel free to message us because we also like learning about your perspectives and what you're able to contribute to this podcast. A third disclaimer is that I'm not the specialist here for religion. I think Kyle is, so he'll do most of the talking for this episode. So think of it like I invited Kyle to be the special guest for this episode. I'll be asking a few questions. He'll just rant and be himself, and it's gonna be great.
I don't think you want.
What?
I don't think people will be ready for Kyle being himself.
Well, that's why you got me, right? I toned you down. So, yeah, let's go.
Yeah, let's go.
Let's go.
Alright, so first things first, let's talk about religion in itself. First question what you have to ask is, what even counts as religion? And it's a very difficult thing to define. What do you think religion is, Nina?
Well, my understanding of it is that it's a set of beliefs about one's place in the universe, usually about factors beyond their control. So I don't want to say higher being, because a lot of religions don't have a higher being, right?
You're right. So there are lots of religions that are non-theistic, which means they don't believe in any God or higher being. So examples are Sikhism, Taoism, Buddhism. They don't have like a God, deity thing that they worship. It's more of like a way of living, a set of beliefs. Actually, there are lots of cornerstones that we might associate with religion that aren't actually important to how we define religion. So, for example, religion doesn't need the existence of a higher being. It also doesn't necessarily mean that you should have a personal God. So, or a personal set of supernatural forces that control you. So, for example, you have the apophatic theologists, apophatic Christians that literally believe that God is nothing, and they also believe that there's no such thing as the existence of the supernatural, because they actually in fact believe that the supernatural transcends existence. There are lots of religions that don't even believe in the afterlife. So it's more about, like what you said, a set of beliefs. So there are, I think, two ways to define or characterize religion. First, it's a set of sincerely held religious beliefs, and the second is that it's an organization, it's a structure. So let's talk about religion as beliefs.
Okay.
Lots of people define religious beliefs as like, it's about faith. It's about faith. But just like so many different things, religious belief and its relationship with faith and reason, they exist in a spectrum. Lots of people believe that religious beliefs is just faith without rationality. Like, they do not think that religion should have anything to do with logic. It just operates in a different plane.
Yeah. And I think that's the basic frame that most people use in debates, which obviously is a misconception.
So it's a valid frame, obviously. Like, it is true that in many instances it is very irrational, but I also think that it's not necessarily the case it's absolutely irrational. In many cases, religious belief isn't irrational. It's more of they operate under different rules of rationality and logic. Which is the reason why I really believe personally that it's very important for you to have different interpretations of the same religious text. So if you have different religious people, conservative religious people saying, oh, you shouldn't have premarital sex. So if you have a bunch of these conservative Christians saying you shouldn't have premarital sex because that's sexual immorality, most of the time, other people will just say, oh, that's not true, because logic. But I believe that if you really want to change their mind, a strategy that you might be able to employ is to use their own texts. Because if you do that, you're using the same systems of reasoning that is inherent in their own faith. So, first you have the characterization that's faith absolutely without rationality. But second, you might be able to talk about faith with rationality in the sense that there are just different rules that they abide by. You can also think of faith with rationality as in the case of scholasticism, where you have lots of logical arguments that try to prove the existence of God. So if you look at, for example, Thomas Aquinas, he was very logical in trying to prove the existence of God and all these different characteristics of God and religion and these spiritual beliefs. And if you read the Summa Theologica, it was actually pretty cool how he just put a bunch of rebuttals to what he was saying, and then he rebutted the rebuttals. It's very debatey.
Yeah.
And finally, and this is my favorite one, because I don't think anybody has talked about this, that faith and religion isn't something that is separate from rationality. Lots of scholars actually believe that religion is in itself some form of rationality, by which we mean it's a legitimate vehicle for cultural knowledge. So you know how, like in the past, we have religion, and religion tells us that we shouldn't do this, we should do this, these types of rituals. And those rituals became religion because doing those same rituals in the past made their community better off.
Yeah, like better harvest, etc.
Yeah, better harvest.
So they saw it as rational.
Yeah, so they saw it as rational.
Or like the other example that religion was used to explain previously unexplained phenomena.
Yes.
So why did the weather change? Why are the stars aligned in certain ways? So they tried to rationalize it with the use of religion. So you could just say it's an outdated form of science. Like, obviously they're wrong, but it came from a place of rationality. They weren't using it to just be irrational or to try to abuse people or trick them. They were legitimately trying to explain something they couldn't.
Alright, yeah, it's correct. So, the point here is you can characterize religion's relationship with rationality and reason and logic in different ways. You can say that it exists absolutely separately from logic. You can say it works alongside logic. You can also say that it is in itself some form of logic.
Yeah.
And this is important for many different debates. For example, you have debates about sincerely held religious beliefs that are sincerely held but are offensive. So is that a valid form of religious belief? Even if it is rational, even if it is sincerely held, it has faith, it has reason, etc., etc., it is sincerely held, but it is potentially offensive. For example, you have black masses, satanic masses, that are basically inversions of Catholic masses, Christian masses. Are they valid forms of religious expression? You also have some debates about beliefs that are insincere, but have all the hallmarks of religious belief. So, you have the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, you have the Church of the Invisible Pink Unicorn, these types of things. Huh?
What is that?
The Invisible Pink Unicorn is
Just
another parody religion, which is, they're trying to parody the fact that a lot of religions have these types of contradictions where it is invisible, but we can see it. Like, it's invisible, but it's pink.
Yeah, okay.
Like, yeah. So they're more logical than faith.
Mm-hmm.
They're more logic than faith. And they're insincerely held, but can they still be considered a religion?
Or the other motion that you already touched on earlier, like using the same religious texts to counter conservative interpretations.
Yes.
Like, that's also a very common debate, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That motion is actually something I'm really into, because I do some Bible study.
Yeah.
Follow me on Twitter, I do Bible studies.
Yes.
Yeah, so there are many different debates about the quality or the legitimacy of these beliefs. And I just think that these three characterizations are helpful in understanding what makes a religious belief a religious belief.
I have a question though.
Yeah.
How do you now differentiate religion from a cult? If they follow the same hallmarks, like a sincerely held belief, there is a structure to it, why do we make differentiations between a cult and religion?
A cult inherently implies esoteric beliefs and esoteric practices. So it means that they're just very, very obscure. A lot of people would argue that the only difference between a cult and a mainstream religion is that a religion is in the mainstream.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah. But other people also say that there are functional differences between a cult and a religion. For example, the politics that goes on within a cult are different from those that happens within a religion. Like, if they try to convert somebody else, cults will rush you into making a decision, while mainstream religions take their time, they give you a choice, etc.
Oh, so processing is also different.
Yeah, so for me, it just depends on how you want to frame it. I don't think that there's any clear-cut difference between a cult and a religion. Because to be fair, there are many mainstream religions that also rush you into converting. There are also mainstream religions that focus on the personality of the leader.
Yeah. So I guess it's just about whether you're lucky or not to be considered a religion, right?
Yeah.
It all boils down to how people perceive you.
So the next part is to talk about religion as an organization. And this is where I was talking about cultural knowledge. So the way that people in the past transferred the knowledge of past generations was through religion. It's because they follow these religious practices that they're able to get a feeling of how past generations have been able to survive. And it's because of this that a lot of people say that religion inherently presupposes the creation of a community. If it is a storage unit of cultural knowledge, it must create a culture, and a culture necessarily entails the existence of community. So, as an organization, it organizes those communities in order to facilitate the passing down of that legitimate cultural knowledge. Which is why, during the colonial era, our communities here in the Philippines, you had towns where the church was the center.
Yeah.
You have lots of laws that are based on religious morality. even our laws right now are tailored around some religious beliefs, like the revised penal code penalizes crimes against religious worship, for example. So, it organizes communities and says, these are the things that are good, these are the things that are wrong. Secondly, as an organization, it necessarily also entails the imposition of dogma. And there are some debates about this, like this house celebrates organized religion, and opposition says that we should oppose organized religion because it imposes upon you, any individual, particular beliefs, particular rituals or practices, and it sort of obscures a personal relationship with God. The imposition of dogma is something that's very important here, because on one hand, it is necessary in order to facilitate the organization of a community where individuals might feel empowered by being in those communities. On the other hand, it might obscure a person's personal connection with God.
So it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword. It's debatable.
Oh. But if you think about it, are there religions that manage to organize itself without having to impose a particular dogma? Like, everyone just agrees naturally to it?
I don't think so. If there are examples, I'd love to.
You'd love to know.
I'd love to know. But as far as I know, if there is a religious organization, there are some tenets that, even if they used to be, agreed upon naturally and organically, over time, they end up becoming dogma as well.
Yeah.
So, in the Catholic faith, for example, you have the magisterium, which is basically top dog, which determines what catechism is and what it should be. So if you preach something that is directly against what the magisterium teaches, you might be in for a lot of trouble.
Exile.
Yeah. Excommunicated.
Yes.
Yeah. So, there. Lastly, like what I said before, you have these, religious diversity. So, in the Catholic faith, for example, you have Gustavo Gutierrez and liberation theology versus Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI.
What was that?
Liberation theology is basically seeing Jesus Christ as a political figure, like radical revolutionary.
Oh.
Yeah, because he really wanted to change basically how the government was structured, because how the government was structured was very oppressive towards different people. If I'm not mistaken, Pope John Paul II didn't agree with this formulation of what Jesus is, because it was too political. It's too grounded on the material plane instead of the spiritual plane. And you have a lot of different examples about religious diversity. Protestants, you have the different sects of Islam, different sects of Christianity. But to me, what's interesting is the way that those different sects emerge is from interactions within and outside the religion. So, religion is actually just one part of a greater whole, which is part of the reason why I think it's very flexible in a lot of different debates that aren't necessarily exclusively about religion. Because even religions by themselves evolved through time, and they took a lot of inspiration from other religions. So, if you notice, so many of our religions, mainstream religions, they have a tree of some sort where life comes from or knowledge comes from, and that comes from shamanism. Like, they have the concept of the all tree, which is why I have very prominent trees in the Garden of Eden, in Norse mythology, and in the Garden of Eden, for example, that's part of the Christian, Judaic, and Islamic faith. It's also there in Hinduism, and because it was there in Hinduism, it was imported into Buddhism. You also have an example of Christianity being influenced by Zoroastrianism, where Zoroastrians believed that a savior, the Saoshyant, had been prophesied who would restore the kingdom of the righteous by fighting against evil and the oppressors. And there will be a final war in the end of days between the forces of good against Ahriman and the forces of evil. You also have Aphrodite Urania, which is the pure form of Aphrodite, being transferred into the Virgin Mary so there's a link between Greek mythology and Christianity and Virgin Mary. So if you see the Virgin Mary, she's Aphrodite.
That was a lot of matter, man.
Yeah, so anyway, my point is...
I'm in shock.
My point is, religions evolve through time, not only because of diversity by themselves, but they also take inspiration from other religions and they use it to grow their own religion. They take the best parts of different religions and make it their own. But also, sometimes it leads to a schism. It leads to a separation between different factions within the religion. This is where you get Protestants moving away from mainstream Christianity. And the reason for that is because there are some changes that are not accepted by the rest of the religion or the religious community. So you also have to analyze what caused the shift and what caused the rest of the community to not agree with the shift.
Yeah, and that's why you have motions like this House believes that progressive Catholic clergy members should self-excommunicate from the church. So it's a question of whether you evolve what you currently have or you splinter off and make a new one.
And for me, one of the ways that you can look at it is by comparing a religion to a social movement. Because social movements, as we've discussed before, they diverge into different splinter movements.
Yeah.
Some of the reasons why those happen is because of the different times that those movements exist in. So, for example, in the past, they didn't care about this particular issue, but in today's world, they care about this particular issue. So the newer converts or the newer members in that religion might disagree with things and they have to split away from it if they keep sticking to the dogma.
Yeah.
If you're tired, you can just look at religion as one big social movement.
No, but there's obviously nuances that you can't just adapt from social movements. Like the fact that it's a lifestyle, the fact that it's a sincerely held belief, like religion and social movements. I could see why they're the same in a way, but obviously their foundations are very, very different.
Yeah, my point is you can just find a parallelism here somewhere.
Yeah.
So, we already discussed how religion is influenced by other religions.
You discussed it.
How about
listened.
how about religion and the state?
Okay, I'm useful here now. Let's go.
Okay, so my favorite example here is the one in China, where you have a lot of Chinese religions, and most of them popped up during the Warring States era, which, by the way, is also known as the period of 100 schools, or the period of 100 philosophers.
Yeah.
It's because the political instability in China at the time meant that lots of people were competing towards finding the best way to fix everything. So you have Confucianism, which is basically yield to authority, follow the law, legalism, these types of things. You have Taoism that basically says, Wu Wei, you shouldn't do anything so much, you should be more humble and stuff, and that's how peace will be attained. So the political atmosphere, the political climate also affects how religions are formed and how religions evolve.
And that's so evident right now in IR. Like, Israel-Palestine is built on the fact that there were religious differences, and their nationalism is deeply rooted in what their religious beliefs are. Yeah.
Yeah, so if you have debates about Israel and Palestine, or if you have debates about religions adhering to public opinion, these types of things, there are lots of different institutions that influence religion already. So it is up to the religion, and you have to argue why it is strategic or not for the religion to yield to it or not to yield to it. Because in the past, it has yielded to public opinion or changing social climates. But a lot of the times also, they refuse to do it. And their refusal made them grow stronger, etc., etc.
Yeah, made them more consistent.
Yeah, made them more consistent.
Yeah.
So, if you're talking about these types of things, you have to analyze the entirety of the dogma and talk about why consistency is such a big reason why people are remaining in that religion, and say why this particular change is inconsistent or irreconcilable with the rest of the religion.
So what I like to do is, when discussing states and religions, I try to think of states like a political party. So if you can parallelize them to social movements, but you can also parallelize them to political parties, which also care about public opinion. So do they evolve to public opinion, or do they hold their consistency as a party? So you can also look at religion as it's just as powerful as people's belief in them, or just as powerful as people want to adhere to what they're practicing or teaching. So the way you deal with this, if it's too broad or too philosophical of a discussion for you, find a way to ground it in what you prefer. So since I'm a pol-sci major, what I prefer doing is grounding it to political realities. Kyle, being a
an econ major,
yeah,
let's talk about the economics of religion,
yeah,
which is something that happens to be legit, apparently. So, the story here was, there was this one time, we were debating the motion, this house supports religious missionaries that proselytize or evangelize in economically depressed communities. And some person said, Kyle, you should do an econ extension. And I was like, you know what? I'll do that. I'll do that. So I made this whole argument about the economics of religion, and I was talking about how religions should allocate their resources in order to most efficiently get their goals. So in that particular motion, I was saying that imagine a marketplace where different advertisers are competing for the attention of a consumer. It's the same thing with religions, trying to evangelize or proselytize others in different communities. Yeah. So think about that. If you have a really economically depressed zone, but there's only a few of them, are you more likely to enter it, right? I don't think you're likely to enter it because there isn't a lot of people there. You're going to spend a lot on the resources to get to those far-flung areas that are economically depressed. You're gonna spend a lot on, like, the food that you're gonna give to them as charity or whatever. And then you're not going to get enough supporters anyway. So that might not be the best place for you to enter as a religion.
But you could also argue that it's first movers advantage. Like, sure, they're not a lot right now, but they could grow in numbers in the future. So wouldn't it be strategic to invest in that particular area for a long-term gain? You
can also argue that maybe a response to that is they are economically depressed because there is no first mover yet. At this point, many different religions know that there's no first mover, so they might all move at the same time, and they're gonna have to compete with one another even more fiercely, and it's going to lead to like a prisoner's dilemma where everyone's just spending and spending, but nothing is getting done. So you might be more well off allocating your resources and your time somewhere else. Yes.
Did we just act on religion? I love it.
Yeah, so this is what I was saying, like, be creative with it, like, think of different angles for religion. I was like, oh, wow, it's politics pala, it's econ pala. So,
yeah, that's interesting.
Love it.
Okay, recap. What have we discussed,
Cal? So recap, what counts as religion? There isn't like a set definition. At most, we can say that they're made of sincerely held religious beliefs. They're organized. And when we're talking about them as beliefs, there are different types of beliefs, especially when you relate them to rationality and logic. If you're talking about them as organizations, there's just a bunch of different characterizations that you can talk about. And you also want to talk about how religions as organizations interact with other institutions and how those interactions create evolution within them.
Like culture,
politics, econ.
Yeah. Yay!
So that's it for the first part. It's really long. This could be an episode by itself. Unfortunately, we have 2 more parts, Nina.
Whew! Let's go, Kyle. Let's go. Part 2 is about religion and the state.
Which is something that I think you would like to talk about.
The first thing to discuss is degree of influence. So obviously, religion for different states and for different political contexts has different roles. So I would want to discuss 3 varying contexts. So first is Saudi Arabia, which has heavy influences in terms of how their religion affects their policies. Like, they have Sharia law, which dictates a lot of the state policies. Like, women not being able to drive for the longest time was dictated because of how women were perceived based on their religion. Eventually, though, that changed, but it's still really dictated by these sincerely held beliefs. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. So, like, in debates about Saudi Arabia, if it's about policy changes, or there have been motions about trying to sanction Saudi in attempts to getting changes done, obviously, that's not going to happen properly because of the heavy influence of religion. I would say that it has such a strong hold that no political agenda or no international interference would actually change that or actually make a dent, right? So that's the first degree of influence I want to discuss, like heavy degrees of influence, which is mostly evident in a lot of Middle Eastern countries. The second thing I want to talk about is the Philippines, which I think stands on the middle ground. We claim to be secular, but there's still a huge degree of influence when it comes to religion, especially in terms of our culture, which affects our policies. So the reason why divorce is still not legalized here in the Philippines isn't really because of some pragmatic reasonings. If you look at it, it always just boils down to religious beliefs. We don't explicitly say it, but you know that the influence of religion is there. You know the influence of the Catholic Church is there. The fact that even our priests and bishops have a huge say in politics, the fact that politicians have to lobby to religious communities and religious groups and even churches, shows that we claim to be secular, but we tend to be at a middle ground because we're still highly reliant on the perception of these religious groups or churches or institutions.
Interestingly, you were talking about divorce.
Yeah.
Here in the Philippines. There's something in our family code that people say is the Philippine divorce. We call it Article 36. Article 36 is basically just annulling a marriage because of psychological incapacity. And part of the reason why the Code Commission put that in was because they wanted to have divorce, actually. But at the same time, they didn't want to anger the conservative Christians. So they found a middle ground, which is basically it can act as if it was divorce, but it's technically not divorce. So you can appease the religious people.
Yeah, so I guess this just proves that we're still not confident enough to be truly secular. We still tiptoe our way around certain policies and certain issues to continuously appease religious groups. So that's the second degree of influence, like a middle ground sort of thing. Like, influence is there, but can be seen as not there. So I think just the Philippines has a weird relationship with religion, especially our politics. And I'm personally not a fan of studying it because it just affects so much.
Okay.
It's not because I hate religion, okay, Kyle? It's just a huge blob.
You're making me sad.
It's just too much of a blob. I can't ground it properly because, especially since it's implicit, how do you research that? How can you explicitly know? There's no data on it. Because we're secular. There's not supposed to be any data on religious influence. So how do you detect something that is supposedly not there, but is there, right?
Well, I could...
What?
There are some theoretical models for how you can talk about that, so... Okay, no, it's gonna be such a bad tangent. But there are lots of studies that try to estimate degrees of religious influence on secular policies.
Yeah, but the fact that it's still I know that because it's still an evolving field, but even the information that we have based on those studies aren't complete yet.
Yes.
So you still can't get a huge picture of Philippine politics based on that alone. The third degree of influence I want to discuss is separationism, which is evident in the United States. So they claim to be purely secular. So Republicans now, at least New Age Republicans, have very conservative leanings based on religious beliefs. But that wasn't always the case. Like for the longest time, before the Trump era or the recent, I'd say it started Obama era to Trump era, that religion is starting to gain a lot of traction. But for the longest time, the United States really was purely secular. Like religion didn't influence their laws. Obviously, religion was protected under the laws, but it didn't go to the point that they had to adhere to biblical texts or they had to adhere to religious beliefs to shape their communities. If anything, they created laws based on secular beliefs. And then religion had to tiptoe around that, had to follow their laws. Like tax exemption obviously existed, but there were exceptions to that too. So religion was still very careful to follow the law. Unlike in the two different contexts I discussed, like in Saudi and the Philippines, like if the religion doesn't like the law, they have all the power to change it. Implicitly, like in the Philippines, through lobbying, or explicitly in Saudi by declaring it not like aligned with their texts. So those are different degrees of influences. And it's important to know this in debates because it gives you an idea of how useful a policy is or not, or how likely a change will be or not. You can also use this as a way of arguing that dogma is strong or not strong. I would use the US as an example that religion is not the end-all be-all and there are ways to circumvent its harms. But I would also use Saudi as an example of how religion truly is something that goes beyond politics and something that can't be changed. So it's up to you. So I'm giving you these three examples so that you can use them in varying debates. So you can use them, I don't know, to maybe pump up your case in any way.
Right. And I think that those last two examples in particular are very interesting because both of those examples, the Philippines and the United States, are secular. But they have these different nuances because in actuality, there isn't just one type of secularism. There are at least two. And one of them is strict separationism, the other is benevolent accommodation. As you can tell, the United States, more often than not, focuses on strict separation, and the Philippines, more often than not, is talking about benevolent accommodation.
So what does that mean?
So, basically, if you think about it, secularism is meant to protect someone from something. But who is being protected and who it's being protected from is what makes a difference here. So if you're trying to completely separate the state and the religion, that's called strict separationism.
Mm-hmm.
And the purpose of strict separationism is to prevent religion from interfering with the state. So in this case, it is the state that's being protected. And this is where you said it's American, and that's precisely correct. It's actually a Jeffersonian view of secularism. And the reason why it's Jeffersonian is because it was Thomas Jefferson who went, look at Europe and all of the weird things that happened because of the excessive intermingling of religion and the state. So what ended up happening was he was talking about strict separation, as in there is an impregnable wall between the state and religions. So in essence, you're trying to say that, the state can't give aid, it can't alleviate the burdens of religion, it's complete separation. Meanwhile, if you're talking about benevolent accommodation, it is still like separation, but you're trying to separate the two in order to protect religion from the state. So in this case, benevolent accommodation means that you're only separate because you want to make sure that people are able to express their religious beliefs. So it's benevolent accommodation because it is the state trying to accommodate religion and trying to empower people's religious beliefs.
But even that has degrees of influence. Like, benevolent accommodation can be extreme, like in the Philippines, where they're accommodating religion so much that it actually influences policies to the point that it shouldn't. Or benevolent accommodation to the point that it's just fulfilling its bare minimum, that it's there to ensure that people are able to practice their beliefs properly. Right? So even that has degrees. So when you're discussing benevolent accommodation, don't just throw the term out. Explain to what extent, because that's also going to play a role. Like, both sides can claim that obviously states need to have benevolent accommodation because religion and religious beliefs are a protected attribute, right?
Yes.
Like, they're, what do you call that? Protected attribute?
Protected attributes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So,
isn't that what equity teams talk about?
Yeah.
Protected attributes.
Yeah. So I just want to know if that's also the legal term. So they're
I'm not sure what the legal term is.
Protected attributes, protected. Anyway, so protected attributes, right? So both sides can claim that benevolent accommodation exists because they're both, protected attributes, both in the Philippines but in Saudi. But you can see that benevolent accommodation obviously exists to different extents. What's the third part, Kyle? The third part.
The third part is about religious exemptions. So, as I said, you have different types of secularism, but in almost all secular environments, you have different degrees of religious exemptions. So, you have conscientious objection when it comes to fighting a war, for example. If you've ever seen Hacksaw Ridge, Andrew Garfield's character became a medic because he was religiously against killing people. So he became a medic. Yeah. So the same principles apply in the United States and in the Philippines. But you also have exemptions from tax when it comes to land that is exclusively used for religious purposes. That's tax exempt. And so those things, you can argue, are there because of benevolent accommodation. In fact, there's a lot of jurisprudence in the Philippines that gives religious exemptions if there's a sincerely held religious belief that says, I cannot, in good conscience, consistent with my religion, participate or follow this law. So the test here is a compelling interest test. So if there's a compelling interest to force you to follow the law, even against your religious belief, the state has the right to do so. But if there is no compelling state interest, if the damages are minimal, if they exist at all, then the state doesn't have the right to do that. So there was a case before, the Ebralinag case, that's what we call it, where Jehovah's Witnesses, who were students, refused to salute the flag and participate in the flag ceremony. Even
Where was
though
this?
Here in the Philippines.
Oh,
I think
okay.
it was in Cebu, I think. And what happened was they got kicked out.
Oh.
Yeah, they got kicked out. In a similar case, the court said, well, if you do this, if you allow them to be exempted, then nationalism will just cease to exist. Like, first you start with people not saluting the flag, and then suddenly people will break laws. But in the Ebralinag case, it overturned that decision by saying that, well, there isn't a huge damage anyway. So even though the interest is there, the damage isn't compelling enough to make the state step in and basically infringe upon religious freedom. So this means that religious freedom has two components in the eyes of the state.
Okay.
The first component is the freedom to believe. And lots of commentators, especially Justice Isagani Cruz, says that the freedom to believe is inalienable, like you can't regulate it. Because, like, the state literally cannot tell you what to think.
Yeah.
You can believe in anything you want. But the second part is freedom to act, which is literally the freedom to act upon your beliefs. And that is the thing that the state can regulate. So the problem here is, when is it okay for a state to limit religious beliefs? It is only when there is a compelling state interest. That's the reason why, even if you believe, for example, in bathing in the blood of newly born people, for example, let's assume that there is
babies?
Okay, fine, babies. Newborns.
Yes.
Okay? Let's assume that, I can't English today either. Let's assume that there is a religion like that. They have the freedom to believe it, but they do not have the freedom to exercise it. Because there's a compelling state interest in protecting babies.
But this is also very debatable. Not the babies being protected, obviously, that has to be upheld. But the extent of religious exceptions. So there was motion, I think, in UADC before about forcing religions to do community service or taxing them, like not giving them the tax exemptions, right?
Yeah.
So I wanna discuss first, because I noticed we sort of jumped the gun. Why do we have benevolent accommodation in the first place? Why is religion protected in the eyes of the state in the first place?
First, like I said, it has to do with the definition of religion. And the definition of religion that we use is, it basically governs a person's relation with God or some other similar entity. Or some other similar belief system, something like a place in the universe. So that's something that is inherent to a person's identity. So the state has to afford the freedom to fully express a person's personal identity.
Yeah.
Yeah, so insofar as religion is a part of that identity, the state has a duty to respect it and empower an individual to accommodate that individual and accommodate that person's identity. And give as many opportunities as possible to practice those facets of the identity. But secondly, I also think that there is a functional reason why. There's a theory that says the reason why they have so many of these exemptions isn't so that the state can literally give them more work. It is because the power to tax, for example, as was said in lots of framers of our constitution, the power to tax is the power to destroy. So if they can taxing religious practices, they're also in effect limiting a person's ability to express his religious beliefs. But thirdly, it also has something to do with the role that religion plays. Because the state recognizes that religion also does things for society. So things like charity and things like that. These are probably the basis why you even have benevolent accommodation. So those are the reasons why you have benevolent accommodation in the first place.
So what's the three again? So the fact that it's your identity.
The fact that it's your identity. Second is the state can't just limit it by taxing them or whatever.
Because taxation is destruction.
Yes.
And the third
is
there's a practical benefit to having religion.
So it's, to some extent, it's like structural functionalism. The only reason why religion exists or still exists is because it serves a function in greater society, and that's something that the state wants to encourage by giving all these privileges.
Social license to operate.
Yes. So if there is a debate about taking away these exemptions, you can choose to talk about how in the past they were given these exemptions because they're supposed to be separate from the state. It's also because they're supposed to be charitable, but neither of those things are absolutely true today. Yeah. So you can make a case for, like, we'll only give you exemptions if you opt to stay out of politics.
Okay. So I would try to rebut those three. First, saying that it's identity. I would respond to that by saying that that's too broad of a standard. Because if your standard is someone's sincerely held beliefs, that could be anything. Second, if the standard for giving exemption was because taxation is destruction, I would flip that and say that, one, it could be necessary. If the church is too powerful, then I'd say that there are instances where the state should be able to step in and curb that power. But second, I would argue that it's not even true that taxation is destruction, because taxation is to benefit other groups. So yes, it's destruction for you in the worst case, but I would argue that, is it really destruction if the money you get from that taxation achieves the same end goal. That you're still going to donate to the poor, you're going to use that money to increase facilities. The third being that there's a pragmatic benefit. I would argue that may be true before, when we didn't have other private entities to do the job of religion entities. Yeah. But then there would be, we now have a lot of hospitals, etc. to do that.
Yeah, but on your first point, you said that, well, it's too broad because a lot of people just sincerely do believe in killing babies. But like I said, you can't limit the freedom to believe, but you can't limit the freedom to act. So that is also recognition that in these certain instances, the state has a power to prioritize the greater good over the individual.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I said, it's about benevolent accommodation. But benevolent accommodation also talks about some policies that try to empower different religious groups. So you have things like Holy Week, where we don't have classes.
Except law students.
Except some law students. Yeah, you have, during the Ramadan, you have special privileges if you are like a Muslim. You have different working times during the Ramadan to accommodate your religious beliefs. So some of the gray areas here is, what if you have a policy that seems neutral but actually benefits a particular religion? So the test here is whether or not, the question here is, firstly, was it the main purpose of the law? And second, are the benefits towards your religion just incidental? And thirdly, you can also ask whether or not it is excessive entanglement with religion.
So recap of the second part. So we discussed degrees of influence and how there are varying states you can use as an example for the role of religion in politics. We talked about different types of secularism, and then we had a mini debate actually about religious exceptions, which I think was fun. One more part to go. Let's go, Kyle. Let's go.
Okay, lastly, we're going to talk about religion and violence. I've been hearing so many different things about religion, like religion creates conflict, but at the same time, religion is also the reason why we have so many good things, like
peace.
Peace. So the third part is about religion and violence.
Okay.
So there are so many different examples for this, but before that, let's take a look at some conceptual framework first. What do we mean when we say violence? Now, there's this guy named Galtung who provided a useful framework for analyzing violence. This is his typologies of violence. There are 3 types of violence. There is direct violence, structural violence, and cultural violence. So what do you mean when we say direct violence? Direct violence is like the most visceral type of violence. It's what we usually think of when we say violence. It represents behaviors that threaten life itself or diminishes a person's capacity to meet basic human needs. So this is like killing, maiming, bullying, sexual assault, emotional manipulation, etc. Structural violence, on the other hand, it represents systematic ways in which some groups are hindered from equal access to those basic opportunities and goods and services that enable the fulfillment of basic needs. So these can be formal structures like laws that discriminate on the basis of religion and can enforce marginalization, like apartheid in South Africa, slavery in the United States, or they could be culturally functional but without a legal mandate, like having limited access to education for marginalized groups. And the third one is cultural violence, which represents the existence of a prevailing social norm that make direct and structural violence seem natural or seem right, or at least acceptable. For example, the belief that Africans are primitive and intellectually inferior is basically like the cultural foundation of slavery, of the justification of slavery as a structural form of violence. And that in itself is the foundation for the direct forms of violence that African American slaves had to experience during the slavery era.
Or in religion, to make it more nuanced, cultural violence is also seen in terms of how we treat Muslims. Like, we attach them to having very, backwards beliefs. Like, we discriminate based on religion because of our, misconceptions of what their religions do and what their actions are because of their beliefs.
Yeah. So basically, if you look at the typologies of violence, it's basically a confluence of malleable factors that merge during particular events in history that shape the conditions for the promotion of violence or create the conditions for peaceful movements to arise. So, it's important to note that these three forms of violence are mutually reinforcing. Direct violence reinforces cultural violence, structural violence, and vice versa. So, they're all mutually reinforcing each other. And this is important because we have to understand that, especially in the case of religion is often the victim of these different types of violence, but they're also sometimes the causes of these different types of violence. Yeah. So, for example, I talked about slavery, but that's not unnuanced to religion because Christianity was a really good basis for slavery, but also it was also a basis for anti-slavery. So if you look at Christianity, it was used both for and against the liberation of African Americans. Because on one hand, the Black Civil Rights Movement, the Martin Luther King people and Malcolm X, they were heavily influenced by Black Baptist churches in America. This is why Martin Luther King ended his speech with, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we're free at last." It's because he was so influenced by religion's role as a liberator for the oppressed. But on the other hand, pro-slavery Christians say that God created slavery with the curse of Cain. And what happened was, okay, this is sort of Bible studies-y time. Okay, Bible study time. Back during the time of Noah, he had several children. One of them saw him naked one time and he got drunk. And then he told the other siblings that, "Oh, Dad's drunk and he's asleep in the tent." And then the siblings clothed him, and when he woke up, he was like, "Dude, I know what you did." So he told Ham, his child, "You know what? Your descendants will be slaves." Yeah, your descendants, the Canaanites, will be slaves. So this plus God's condemnation of slavery in Leviticus made for a lot of the justifications made by Christians on slavery. So religion actually acts somewhat of a cultural violence already in these types of instances. But it also can serve as a counter-narrative to that cultural oppression, that cultural violence. So in the same way that it creates violence, it also sows the seeds for
peace.
In
the future.
Yeah, in the future.
So it's like an enabler or inhibitor all at the same time, depending on how it's used.
Yeah, another example is engaged Buddhism. Do you know Thich Nhat Hanh?
Familiar?
So Thich Nhat Hanh was against the Vietnam War, and he was a Buddhist. And what happened was he was exiled from Vietnam because his anti-war stance, that was based, by the way, on Buddhism, doesn't jive with the government's agenda. And even today, a lot of sectors of Buddhism that don't agree with how the government is running things, they're still exiled to this day. Yeah, so like decades later, they're still exiled. And what the government did was they made Buddhism like a very important part of their policy. So you have parts of Buddhism that are government sanctioned, and you also have Buddhism that isn't government sanctioned and are exiled.
Are these the 14 tenets you keep talking to me about?
Yes. In engaged Buddhism, there are 14 tenets. The very first tenet is that there is no absolute truth. Even Buddhism does not contain absolute truth. This is like very important because you have Buddhism oppressing other Buddhists also, but it is also the oppressed Buddhists that try to create peace. So the point here is you have a dominant religion that can oppress a minority religion, even though they're both the same religion.
Based on interpretation.
Based on how they interpret the same text. So these typologies of violence can be used to analyze how oppression happens. So, like off the bat, you already have 3 levels to describe the violence and oppression that's happening, as well as the resulting religious diversity that comes about because of that oppression. Because within a particular religion, if you say something, if the religion has a particular dogma, the people who disagree will most likely be alienated, most likely be oppressed. So if you're going to have a religion that is, like, for example, very warlike, for example, right? You will always have dissenters in that religion. So in the same way that the religion can cause violence, it also can cause peace as well. That's the reason why you have so many different examples of whether or not religion is good or bad. But just looking at those isolated examples does not, they're not enough, because you need to have the context behind why those different sects of those religions exist. So the point of this first part is religion and the text of religion can be used actually to justify violence. But there is another perspective here that says religion doesn't actually do that. There are other people who say that religion is actually just an amplifier for inherently secular conflicts. So if you have, for example, ISIS, the Islamic State, on one hand, people say it's like actually Islamic in nature because they're taking their methods from the life of Muhammad, from the Quran, etc. But there are also people who say that it's not actually because of Islam that they do it. So people like Mehdi Hassan, who say that if it's really a warlike religion, nobody else is doing it. And the reason for that is because if you look at most terrorist organizations, it's actually because of secular reasons why they ended up becoming terrorists to begin with. And they're just using religion to amplify those things. So if you want to analyze ISIS, you can use this analysis. If you want to talk about Israel and Palestine, you can also talk about it because it's inherently a secular territory dispute, but they're using differences in religion to amplify the conflict. You want to look at Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar versus the Buddhists. You think that it's about a religious conflict, but it's actually about some leftover effects of British colonialism in the past. Like, essentially, this type of argument is saying that religion isn't the cause of the conflict. It is just an amplifier for those conflicts. So, yeah.
Are you okay? You got that all out of your chest?
No, there's so much more. Okay. So, my point here is the same point as Graham E. Fuller, who wrote this book called A World Without Islam. He said that even in the absence of Islam, the same political instability would exist today.
But they just find another reason to back it up.
Yeah, not Islam, but some other reason.
Yeah.
So, there are debates, for example, a debate about like the Muslim world rejecting religious fundamentalism as Islamic, like calling them, like issuing fatwas declaring terrorist groups to be un-Islamic. Yeah, so on one hand, they would probably have basis to say it's not Islamic because it's just using Islam as a tool to forward their secular beliefs. But on the other hand, you also cannot deny that a lot of their practices are based on religious texts. So the point of this entire section is that religion doesn't just exclusively cause violence. And if it does, it might not necessarily be because of the religion. So that is like this huge field where debates can happen. Yeah, it's just really important that people understand the conceptual framework behind why these conflicts emerge as opposed to just citing these examples. Because if you have those examples, but you don't have the logic to back it up, it's just dogma after dogma, like just...
It's just gonna be a debate about who has better examples.
Exactly. So for me, it's more about logic than examples at this point.
Okay. Thanks so much, Kyle, for all that about religion.
Yes.
Anything else you want to end this episode on?
Religion is best girl.
Religion is best girl.
It is wife.
Well, so, recap. We discussed what religion is, religion in itself, religion's role with the state, and religion's role with violence. Basically, if there are any takeaways, just remember that it's a huge field. Just be very creative. There's a lot of material you can read up on to better understand religion. So we apologize for this really long episode.
I'm not apologizing for anything.
I apologize on Kyle's behalf for this really long episode, but again, I stand by with Kyle in saying that this is really important matter to know about. Even if you don't have religion-themed motions, I hope that you take note of what we discuss. Give this podcast a listen because it can be applicable in so many other things. You want to do the outro, Kyle? This was your episode, basically.
Oh, I think you should do the outro.
Yeah, because I didn't talk at all in this episode.
Yeah,
it's okay. I will make up for it during like international international relations or an episode about adjudication.
Oh, jeez. Okay.
Oh, so thanks for listening to this special episode of Debatable with your hosts Tina and Kyle. So again, I'm Nina.
I'm Kyle.
And if you aren't aware, we made a Curious Cat account. So if you have anonymous questions, you can send them in at curiouscat/podcastdebatable, or was it podcastdbtbl? One of those. You can just check our Twitter to find the link. The reason why we made it is because no one was sliding into our DMs. We suspected it's because you guys are afraid of revealing your identities. So we gave you a anonymous avenue to do so. And true enough, we've been getting a lot of questions.
So many questions.
Specifically about Kyle's relationship status. So
I'm single. Again. I'm still single, guys.
So, thanks so much. We hope you have a great Holy Week. And we'll see you in next week's episode. If you want to know what it's about, we don't know either. So let us know in the suggestions what you'd want to listen to. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.